You know, we don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but what might it mean if we had a Biden presidency, but the Republicans retained control of the Senate? You know, it might actually present some interesting opportunities. Let's talk about that, because justice matters. Hey all, Glenn Kirshner here. So we're still waiting for all of the votes to be counted. We're waiting for the final result with respect to who's going to be the president for the next 4 years. And look, we can't count our chickens, but it feels like the shells are beginning to crack. So I've had some people send me messages or send me tweets about, well, what happens to the prospect of accountability, right? I always talk about the Trump Crimes Commission. You know, as a former 30-year federal prosecutor, accountability for the crimes, particularly the crimes of political criminals, kind of important to me, right? So what, if anything, happens on the accountability front, the ability to investigate, indict, and prosecute the political criminals that have been hiding in plain sight under our noses for the past 4 years? What happens if Joe Biden takes the White House, but Mitch McConnell retains control of the Senate? The Republicans hold the Senate. Couple of principles. First of all, the law enforcement function of the executive branch under a President Joe Biden, right? The ability to investigate crime, the FBI, the ability to prosecute crime, the Department of Justice, and all 94 United States attorneys' offices, which are the field offices for the Department of Justice. Their law enforcement function is completely independent from Congress, independent from the House of Representatives, independent from the Senate. So the fact, if it ends up a fact, that Mitch McConnell and the Republicans retain control of the Senate really will not impede Joe Biden or the Attorney General that he appoints, their ability to move forward with criminal investigations, indictments, and prosecutions. But we all know that, you know, Mitch McConnell retaining control of the Senate conjures up all sorts of notions of legislation not being allowed to progress, not being allowed to be debated or voted on in the Senate, and judicial nominees being held up unconstitutionally, being deprived of the sort of constitutional requirement that they get a hearing, that the Senate provide advice and consent. So there are a lot of questions that are conjured up in the event Joe Biden takes the presidency and the Republicans retain control of the Senate. Before we turn to those questions, I want to talk about some of the other things that will flip in a Biden presidency, even if the Senate ends up not flipping. And it's an open question, perhaps unlikely given what we're seeing, that the Senate will flip. But here are so many of the things that will flip in the event Joe Biden wins the presidency. The Department of Justice leadership will flip. It will flip from being lawless to being lawful. It will flip from being law-breaking to being law-enforcing. That'll flip. The Department of Education will flip. It will flip from being anti-public education to being pro-public education. The EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, will flip. It will flip from damaging and destroying our environment to protecting and preserving our environment. The Department of Homeland Security will flip. It will flip from caging children to reuniting children with their families. The Department of Veterans Affairs will flip. It will flip from suckers and losers to patriots and heroes. So if Joe Biden wins, then we've already won. But let's go back to the Senate for a minute. if Mitch McConnell continues to fancy himself the grim reaper of legislation, the keeper of the crypt, where all bills duly passed by the House of Representatives go to die, how might Joe Biden respond? Well, I suggest one way to respond is by pushing the envelope on all executive orders. Try to do the work of the American people via executive orders. And you know what? If that inspires lawsuits, Mitch McConnell or others want to try to bring suit to challenge executive orders that are signed by Joe Biden, I think the Biden administration could walk into court and make the argument that, well, Mitch McConnell really unlawfully, unconstitutionally refuses to move legislation forward once it is passed by duly elected members of the House of Representatives, Republicans and Democrats alike. He thinks he's one man who gets to thwart the will of the American people by not letting any of those bills be debated or voted on once they get to the Senate. So the president, the executive branch, had to try to do some of the work of the American people via executive orders. That argument might resonate with courts, or at least Mitch McConnell might be made to account. How about justices, Supreme Court justices, right? It conjures up visions of what Mitch McConnell did to Merrick Garland. He unconstitutionally refused to give Merrick Garland his hearing, his advice and consent hearing, as the Constitution requires. And unfortunately, nobody fought him on that. If Joe Biden nominates a Supreme Court justice, somebody to fill a vacancy that comes open on the Supreme Court, and Mitch McConnell refuses to do what the Constitution requires him to do, right? It's Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution, the Senate shall provide advice and consent. What I recommend Joe Biden do is tell his judicial nominee to the Supreme Court, then just go ahead and take your spot on the Supreme Court, because it looks like the Senate has waived its opportunity to provide advice and consent. And then let Mitch McConnell run into court, federal district court in Washington, D.C., and try to convince a judge and then try to convince an appellate court that he, as one man, gets to rewrite the Constitution. He gets to say there will be no advice and consent hearing on a presidential Supreme Court justice nominee because I, Mitch McConnell, say so. I don't care what the Constitution requires. Mitch McConnell will lose that fight. It's a foolish position to take, and we need to call him on it. And then third, when it comes to accountability, when it comes to the Trump Crimes Commission, when it comes to holding all political criminals accountable for the crimes they've committed in broad daylight for the past 4 years, whether they're elected politicians, appointed politicians, whether they're hired into federal service, whether they're family members of elected politicians. If Mitch McConnell doesn't want to pass any legislation, well, you know what? Then the executive branch doesn't need to spend time on legislation, doesn't have to come up with plans that they then offer to Congress and meet with Congress to try to get those plans put into effect. They don't need to spend a lot of time debating on whether to sign or veto legislation that makes its way through the system because Mitch McConnell won't be legislating. So I guess the executive branch will be free to spend a whole lot of time and energy and resources investigating, indicting, and prosecuting crime, particularly political criminals. Maybe it's a win-win. So there are options and opportunities for a Biden administration if Mitch McConnell wants to continue to be the unconstitutional obstacle, trying to be nice, that he has been for the past 4 years. You know, there are ways to address it. They require taking the gloves off. Folks, as always, stay safe, stay tuned. We should know in the next 24 to 48 hours, notwithstanding the protracted, frivolous legal challenges that Trump has been launching against the election. The President of the United States demanding that, lawfully cast ballots not be counted. Justice is coming, though, folks, and justice matters. I look forward to talking with y'all again tomorrow.